Imagine being 12 years old, standing on the edge of a vast wilderness and realizing that the world you thought was safe is a lie. Mercy Harrow's story begins like that, lost, orphaned, and beautiful in ways that made danger notice her before anyone else did. The Kentucky winter of 1798 was merciless, a cold so sharp it cut through wool and bone alike. The frontier promised freedom, fertile land, and opportunity, but it also hid shadows darker than any forest night. Mercy had traveled with relatives she barely knew, clutching the last fragments of a childhood stolen by fever and grief. And then, like a predator sensing weakness, Daniel Crenshaw appeared. At 19, he seemed a savior, strong, educated, confident, the kind of man who could guide families through treacherous terrain. He smiled, he spoke warmly, and in his gaze Mercy sensed something she didn't understand, a fascination that felt like both attention and ownership. What Mercy didn't know, and what no one at the time could have guessed, was that Daniel had been practicing a different craft in the wilderness for 3 years, not guiding, not protecting, killing. He perfected methods that would leave entire families missing, bodies untraceable, all while maintaining the illusion of a trustworthy guide. When he offered to take Mercy with him, she thought it was love, destiny, salvation. She did not yet see the calculations behind his charm, the way he measured her intelligence, her vulnerability, her youth. Every word he spoke was a tool, every gesture a trap. And when the first winter passed with fires burning and snow frozen into the trees, Mercy felt warmth and safety, but beneath it, an undercurrent of menace she could not yet name. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? I want to know, because the secrets I'm about to reveal are not just history, they are a map of human corruption, and your awareness will determine whether you see it coming in your own life. The winter passed, but the warmth of Mercy's brief comfort was fragile, like ice underfoot. Daniel's cabin, hidden among oaks and rocks, became both sanctuary and prison. By day he taught her the skills of survival, tracking, reading the weather, observing the land. By night, he whispered dreams of partnership, of adventure, of a life that made her feel chosen. And she believed him. She could not yet see the meticulous calculation behind every word. He had studied her since the moment he laid eyes on her, noting her intelligence, her reading ability, her innocence. These were not virtues to him, they were tools, tools that would later turn her own knowledge and trust against the people she would guide, and ultimately, against herself. Mercy began to record meticulously the trails, the passes, the hidden shortcuts. She documented what she learned from Daniel about families traveling west, writing down what she thought was for their safety. Every name, every detail, every hope and fear of those who trusted Daniel became data. Without her realizing it, she was feeding the mechanism of death he had perfected. The first clients arrived in spring, hard-working families seeking new lives. Daniel welcomed them with charm, asked carefully crafted questions, and steered their attention where he wanted it. Mercy watched, heart fluttering, thinking she was merely learning the ways of the frontier, unaware that she was watching the prelude to murder. And then came the first signs she could not ignore. Things Daniel said in private, shadows in his eyes, his excuses for leaving for days at a time. They did not add up. The things he brought back, claimed to have traded or scavenged, hinted at something darker, something deliberate. The quiet was wrong. The forest held too many secrets, and Daniel was one of them. Mercy's heart, so young and trusting, began to feel the first stab of fear, the kind that burrows deep into your bones when you sense a predator waiting in the dark, just beyond sight. By the time spring fully arrived, the wilderness was alive, the trails busy, and Mercy realized that her life was no longer her own. She was a witness, a participant, and a victim, caught in a trap she could not yet name, and one whose consequences would stretch far beyond the boundaries of the Kentucky wilderness. Spring brought light, but for Mercy, it brought only shadows she could no longer ignore. The first family, the Harmons, had passed through under Daniel's guidance, and though they arrived safely, or so he claimed, something about the way he spoke to them, the intensity in his gaze, left her uneasy. He asked questions, probing and precise, about their belongings, their plans, their finances, their letters home. He catalogued every detail with an obsession that now made her stomach churn. And when he returned alone, his pockets full of items the family had no reason to part with, Mercy felt the first real stirrings of dread. Her diary became a confession she could not speak aloud. She began to record oddities, discrepancies in Daniel's stories, the days he vanished without explanation, the things he brought back. Each entry was a thread in a tapestry she was too terrified to fully unravel. But intelligence, even in a child, notices patterns. And Mercy began to notice a pattern in Daniel's care, his charm, his attention. It was not love, it was control. Everything he did, every gentle word, every compliment, every plan of adventure, it was manipulation. He was shaping her, guiding her obedience, cultivating her trust, and using her abilities to perfect his cruel operations. Then came the Pritchards. Wealthy, trusting and unaware, they arrived with 2 wagons loaded with valuables. Daniel's behavior shifted immediately, subtly, but with a precision that set Mercy's heart hammering. He barred her from seeing them, citing her pregnancy, and spoke with a harshness she had never heard before. "You will obey me, Mercy," he said, his voice cold, calculated. The words sliced through her like a blade. She obeyed, but the seeds of fear had been planted. From the window she watched as he studied their wagons, their possessions, the routes they intended to take. Every glance, every movement screamed danger. For the first time, Mercy realized she was no longer merely a companion or apprentice. She was part of a system she barely understood, a system that took in families, studied them, and decided which would survive and which would vanish. And in that moment, she understood. The man she loved was orchestrating something monstrous. Her role, her knowledge, her innocence, all of it was now a tool in a machine of death. The next morning, the silence of the forest felt suffocating. Mercy could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion in her chest. She knew something had happened to the Pritchards. Daniel had left early, escorting them through Devil's Canyon, promising her she would remain safely behind. But the echo of gunshots, the sudden piercing screams she had heard the evening before, burned in her mind. She could not stay idle. Fear clawed at her, but curiosity, that sharp edge of intelligence he had once praised, drove her forward. She left the cabin, every step heavy with dread, every branch crackling underfoot, like the whisper of something waiting to strike. 2 miles from the cabin, behind a boulder, she saw it, the first undeniable proof that the life she thought she had entered was a lie. Signs of struggle, broken possessions scattered across the earth, a trail of blood leading into the shadows of the canyon. Her stomach turned. She could feel the life growing within her, trembling, the fragile barrier between innocence and experience shattered by the sheer weight of what she was seeing. Mercy realized in that instant that Daniel's charming words, the promise of protection, of partnership, they were a lie. The wilderness, which she had thought a place of learning and beauty, had become an instrument of death under his control. Panic and clarity collided inside her. She understood with a terror that rooted her to the spot that Daniel had planned this. Every family, every route, every carefully curated interaction, they were all part of a meticulous system of exploitation and murder. Her trust, her obedience, her intelligence, tools in his mechanism. She had unwittingly been complicit, recording maps, noting trails, cataloging families, helping him refine his methods. And now, watching the aftermath of his efficiency, she understood that she alone had seen it all, that she was the only witness to a horror no one else would survive to speak of. Mercy's heart pounded, not just from fear, but from a dawning awareness. The life she had been promised was gone. What remained was a labyrinth of terror, of secrets, of a man who wielded charm as weapon and innocence as prey. She had to survive, she realized, not just for herself, but for the truth that no one would believe. And yet, survival meant confronting the darkness she had been too young to comprehend, knowing that escape might already be impossible. Mercy's mind raced as she retraced her steps back to the cabin, every shadow suddenly alive, every sound a threat. She had seen what Daniel had done, or at least enough to know the truth. The Pritchards were gone, their wagons abandoned, their lives extinguished. And yet, the question gnawed at her relentlessly. How could a man so young, so seemingly ordinary, orchestrate such precise horror without leaving a trace? Her own hands trembled as she opened her diary, writing feverishly, not to record weather or trails this time, but the dark truths she now carried alone. The words themselves felt like an incantation, a desperate attempt to make sense of a nightmare she had no escape from. That night, Daniel returned. His expression was calm, his voice gentle, the mask flawless. "Everything went smoothly," he said, as if announcing the weather. Mercy looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him fully. Not the guide, not the romantic figure, not the man who had promised protection, but the predator he truly was. Her body recoiled from him, but her mind knew she had to be careful. Every step, every word, every glance had to be measured. One misstep could mean death, not just for her, but for the child she carried, and for anyone who might try to help her. She tested him subtly, asking questions about the families, pretending ignorance, masking her fear with curiosity. Each answer confirmed the horror she already suspected. He was calculating, methodical, relentless, and she realized something even more terrifying. He had been grooming her from the start, turning her intelligence and obedience into weapons for his system. She had unknowingly become an accomplice, a silent participant in crimes too monstrous for most minds to comprehend. As she lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, she understood the cruelest truth. The wilderness had claimed her not by accident, but by design. And within that revelation, a spark ignited, a need to survive, to understand, and to record what no one else could ever see. Her diary would become a map of evil, a testament to a darkness that had existed in plain sight, invisible to all but the ones unfortunate enough to see it. By late April, the forest was alive with movement, families, wagons, travelers seeking new beginnings. Mercy watched from the cabin as another family approached, the Pritchards' tragedy still fresh in her mind. Their faces were full of hope, unaware that the wilderness held predators far more dangerous than bears or bandits. Daniel's eyes gleamed with anticipation, the same cold precision she had seen before, and Mercy felt her stomach twist. She knew that she was again a silent observer of the machinery of death, forced to play her part whether she wanted to or not. This family, like the others, was carefully chosen, wealthy enough to matter, vulnerable enough to be intercepted. Daniel's charm was effortless. He welcomed them warmly, asking questions with the same disarming gentleness that had first ensnared Mercy. She observed from the shadows, notebook in hand, documenting everything he did, every subtle signal, every manipulation. Her fear had evolved into clarity. She could see the patterns now, the way he asked about finances, the way he catalogued possessions, the way he studied their habits and routines. And in her heart, she felt the sickening knowledge that the next tragedy was already planned, waiting to be executed with military precision. Her own role was no longer innocent. Daniel had trained her to keep records, to track details, to observe without interfering. Every map she had drawn, every note she had taken, had become a part of the system that would decide life and death. Yet she could not stop herself. Survival demanded compliance, silence, obedience. She was trapped in a psychological labyrinth where fear was a chain and intelligence a weapon against herself. And in that silence, a strange determination arose. Mercy knew that words had power, that observation could become evidence. If she survived, if she could endure the horrors to come, she would document everything, every crime, every manipulation, every hidden truth. And as the family approached the cabin, unaware of the nightmare awaiting them, Mercy felt the first flicker of a promise to herself to bear witness, even if it cost her life. As the new family settled near the cabin, Mercy felt the walls closing in. Daniel moved among them like a conductor, orchestrating every word, every glance, every action. His charm was a weapon, precise and unyielding. Mercy watched him, notebook clutched tightly, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. The family laughed, shared stories of home, dreamed aloud of new lives in the bluegrass region. But Mercy saw the threads of control weaving invisibly through every interaction. They were puppets, and Daniel was the master of a stage built in the wilderness, hidden from anyone who might have questioned his methods. Mercy's pregnancy made her movement slow, her body fragile, but her mind was sharper than ever. Every detail mattered. The way he asked Mr. Pritchard about letters or hidden valuables, the way he observed Mrs. Pritchard's eyes when she mentioned their plans. He catalogued their routines with a precision that was terrifying, and she realized with sick clarity that he had studied human behavior the way a chess master studies pawns. Each family was a game, each life a calculated variable. At night, when Daniel returned to the cabin, his demeanor softened, his words full of tenderness. But Mercy now knew the mask. Every gentle gesture, every whispered promise was designed to manipulate her trust, to keep her compliant. He praised her meticulous records, calling her invaluable, while secretly using her knowledge to perfect his system of murder. The very intelligence that had once been her protection now bound her to the darkness. Mercy began to understand a grim truth. Survival in this world required obedience, but knowledge was power. She had to record, remember, and analyze, not for him, but for herself. Every observation, every hidden detail could become her shield, her weapon, her only hope of escaping the nightmare. And as the family slept, unaware of the dangers closing in, Mercy realized she was no longer a child, no longer innocent. She had become a witness, trapped in a predator's web, carrying truths that could destroy her mind if she allowed them to. Night fell like a shroud over the wilderness, thick and suffocating. Mercy lay in the cabin, listening to the forest, each snap of a branch or distant animal cry, a jolt of fear through her body. She knew Daniel had left earlier, claiming to scout ahead, but the knowledge of what she had already seen, the Pritchards, the blood, the chaos, made her pulse hammer with anticipation and dread. Her hands trembled over her diary as she tried to record her thoughts, but words felt inadequate. How could she capture the enormity of the evil she now understood was real? Then she heard it. The faintest crack of wood breaking, a whisper of movement outside. Her breath caught, seconds stretched into eternities. And then, the first gunshot. A metallic report that cut through the night, followed by another, and then screams. High-pitched, desperate, short, terrifyingly human. Mercy's heart slammed against her chest, but she could not flee. She was trapped in the cabin, forced to watch the consequences of the man she had once trusted. The noises stopped suddenly, swallowed by the night as if the forest itself had absorbed the horror. Silence returned, but it was no comfort. It was a warning. Mercy knew the next step was inevitable. Daniel would return. And when he did, she would face the calm, unshakable man who had orchestrated murder as casually as he had instructed her to track the stars. Yet in that frozen moment, something within her stirred. Fear, yes, but also clarity. She was witnessing evil firsthand, seeing the machinery of death operate in real time. She understood that survival meant more than obedience. She had to learn, to remember, to catalogue every detail, to anticipate his moves. Each observation could be a lifeline, each word in her diary a weapon against the darkness that sought to consume her. And as the forest settled around her, Mercy realized that from this night onward, nothing in her world would ever be innocent again. Dawn broke weakly over the forest, a pale light that did little to chase away the darkness Mercy now carried within her. Daniel returned, his steps silent, deliberate, carrying the air of a man untouched by the violence he had orchestrated. He greeted her with warmth, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Everything went as planned," he said, voice smooth as velvet, yet beneath it lay a current of control that twisted Mercy's stomach. He glanced at her diary, saw her meticulous notes, and nodded approvingly, reinforcing her sense that she was both useful and trapped. Mercy's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but fear held her still. Every fiber of her being knew she could not act openly. Her pregnancy made her slow, her youth made her vulnerable, and Daniel's intelligence made him omnipresent, even when he was out of sight. She began to test the limits of her mental space, crafting subtle ways to resist internally while outwardly obeying. Her notebook became her shield, a silent archive of truth no one else could witness. She recorded every lie, every gesture, every subtle manipulation Daniel used to bend families and herself to his will. He spoke to her as if nothing had occurred, weaving dreams of adventure, purpose, and partnership. "You are extraordinary, Mercy," he said, placing a hand over hers, but she knew now that extraordinary was not praise. It was a label, a marker identifying her as someone whose intelligence and innocence could be exploited. Each compliment was a chain, each act of affection a tether to his system. Mercy realized she had to think like him to survive, observe, anticipate, calculate. Her mind became a labyrinth of shadows, mapping his moves, predicting his manipulations, and secretly cataloguing the patterns of his killings. For the first time, she tasted the bitter edge of awareness. Knowledge could save her, but only if she mastered it without him knowing. And in that terrifying clarity, she began the slow, dangerous work of resistance. Quiet, hidden, invisible. By mid-May, the forest thrummed with life, but for Mercy, every sound carried menace. Another family approached the cabin, their wagon wheels crunching over frozen earth, laughter spilling into the wilderness, unaware of the shadow waiting. Daniel moved among them with the ease of a predator in plain sight, his charm a weapon of subtle terror. Mercy watched, notebook in hand, noting every word, every question, every glance. She had learned to read him, to predict his intentions, to see the hidden calculation behind his smiles. This was no longer a simple pattern of manipulation, it was ritual. He extracted details about finances, routines, personal losses, and hopes. Every story they told became data, every movement became evidence for his system. And Mercy, once innocent, now a recorder of human behavior, felt the weight of her own complicity. Her intelligence, her education, the very skills that had once set her apart, were now instruments of a death machine she could neither stop nor fully expose. As the family settled, Daniel instructed Mercy to catalogue supplies, observe behaviors, and report unusual details. "Your mind is extraordinary," he said, voice soft, almost hypnotic. But Mercy now understood the darker meaning. Extraordinary meant useful, compliant, obedient. Every compliment, every tender word, tightened the invisible chains binding her to him. Her fear was constant, but beneath it a flicker of defiance glimmered. Alone in the cabin at night, she wrote feverishly, not weather logs, but truth. She recorded each interaction, every calculated smile, every question designed to extract wealth and vulnerability. And then she paused, pen hovering over the page, realizing that the knowledge she carried was power, but also a curse. She could survive only by remaining invisible, silent, obedient. Yet within the pages of her diary, she planted the seeds of resistance. And she whispered to herself in the dark, one day the truth must emerge, even if she did not survive to see it. Mercy's awareness had transformed her. She was no longer a child, no longer naive. She was a witness, a chronicler, and the quiet architect of her own fragile survival strategy. As spring deepened, Mercy began to see patterns beyond Daniel's immediate actions, the killings, the disappearances, the careful selection of families. It was not chaos. It was a system, a network of methodical control that extended further than she had feared. Each family, each wagon, each map she had drawn in her diary felt like a piece of a puzzle far larger than the wilderness itself. She started noticing signs Daniel left behind, secret markings along the trail, coded references in his notes, the subtle way he questioned travelers about others moving west. He was not merely a murderer, he was a strategist, a man whose reach extended beyond the mountains and rivers into hidden corridors of influence that Mercy could only guess at. Mercy's heart pounded with terror and fascination. She realized that Daniel's charm, his education, his calculated kindness were all designed to create obedience, not just from her, but from the families who passed through. It was psychological warfare. Soft, invisible chains that left no evidence but bound minds and wills with terrifying efficiency. She could see it in the eyes of those he questioned, fear masked by gratitude, terror cloaked as trust. And she understood that she was both a participant and a witness, caught in a system that preyed on human vulnerability with surgical precision. At night, she wrote feverishly, each word a record of truth she might never be able to reveal. Her own survival demanded that she be invisible, obedient, and seemingly compliant. But her mind was plotting, cataloging, analyzing every detail. She could not confront him directly. The wilderness was his domain, and any resistance could cost her life. Yet she whispered to herself in the dark, planting a seed of identity, a reminder that she was not merely a victim. I see. I remember. From that moment, Mercy became more than a girl trapped in a predator's design. She became a keeper of forbidden knowledge, the silent recorder of horrors that would haunt the frontier for generations. And within that knowledge, a quiet fire began to burn, a will to survive, to expose, to resist. Mercy's mind had sharpened into a tool of survival. She understood now that fear alone could not protect her. Intelligence, patience, and subtle observation were her weapons. She began to test Daniel carefully, probing his routines, noting when his attention slipped, mapping his moods and patterns. Outwardly, she remained compliant, the obedient young wife, her pregnancy a convenient excuse for her stillness. Inwardly, she catalogued every word, every gesture, every calculated smile, piecing together the mechanisms of his control. Each night, by candlelight, her diary became more than a record. It became a map of the predator she could not escape. Daniel, confident in his mastery, continued his system, bringing families through the wilderness, questioning, cataloguing, evaluating. Mercy observed as he assessed wealth, vulnerability, and trust. The precision of his work was terrifying. Every family, every interaction seemed part of a design larger than the frontier, and yet, for the first time, she realized she could anticipate him. Not confront him directly, that would be death, but predict, influence, and survive. Knowledge, she discovered, was the only power that could counteract his dominance. She began experimenting subtly, testing his control over her environment. A miswritten note here, a question phrased differently there, small deviations in her obedience, all designed to gauge his reactions. Each tiny act of resistance was a calculated risk, but also a spark of agency. She was no longer a passive observer. She was an active participant in her own survival, quietly learning to manipulate the world he had trapped her in. Mercy understood something critical: her diary, her observations, her memory. These were her lifelines. They were invisible to Daniel, yet they carried the weight of truth that could one day expose him. And in the darkness of that cabin, surrounded by a wilderness alive with both beauty and menace, she made a silent vow. She would survive, she would endure, and she would remember. Every secret, every crime, every hidden agenda, she would carry them all. Spring ripened into early summer, and with it came another family, their wagon laden with hope and valuables, blissfully unaware of the predator waiting on the edge of the forest. Mercy watched from the cabin window, her pulse a relentless drum. Daniel greeted them with warmth, charm, and a precision that was surgical in its subtlety. Every word, every gesture, every question was designed to uncover what they carried, how they thought, what they feared. Mercy's stomach turned as she realized she now understood the full scale of his system, a web of manipulation and control stretching far beyond what she had imagined. That night, as the family settled near the cabin, Daniel instructed Mercy to catalogue their supplies, observe their routines, and report unusual behavior. "You are invaluable, Mercy," he whispered, his voice soft, almost hypnotic, as if rewarding her obedience. But she knew the truth behind the words. He was training her to be a perfect witness, a recorder of details that would feed the machinery of his killings. Her mind raced with fear, anger, and a dawning sense of responsibility. She could not interfere openly, but she could think, remember, and survive. In the quiet of the cabin, she wrote in her diary, cataloguing every detail. "And now for you, the one hearing this story, I ask something important. Comment the phrase, 'I see the shadows,' twice. Let it mark your awareness. Let it anchor you. The act is more than engagement. It is a symbolic acknowledgement of knowledge, a recognition that once you see hidden truths, your perception of the world can never be the same." Mercy's own sense of power, fragile but growing, mirrored this ritual. She realized that to survive, she had to become like Daniel in intellect but not in cruelty. Observation, memory, and subtle resistance were her weapons, and as the night deepened, the forest alive with unseen eyes, he understood the horrifying reality. The darkness around her was not random. It was engineered, and she alone could navigate it. Night fell heavy over the cabin, suffocating in its silence as Mercy crouched near the window, heart hammering. The new family slept unaware, their laughter from the day replaced by the stillness of trust, a trust that Daniel would exploit with methodical precision. He moved like a shadow through the moonlight, inspecting wagons, cataloguing possessions, his eyes sharp and calculating. Every motion was deliberate, every gesture a measure of human vulnerability. Mercy's stomach twisted with horror. She could see the machinery of his system operating in real time, a predator at work, turning hope into prey. She understood now that obedience alone would not save her. She had to think, anticipate, and document. Every scrap of knowledge, every observation, every detail she recorded in her diary was a lifeline. Daniel's brilliance was terrifying. He studied people like an architect studies a blueprint, predicting actions, reactions, and weaknesses, and she was complicit, the unwitting assistant to a mind capable of orchestrating death with surgical precision. As he returned to the cabin later that night, his expression soft, his voice gentle, Mercy fought the instinct to flinch. Each compliment, each affectionate touch was a chain, binding her more tightly to his will. But she had begun to see cracks, moments when his attention slipped, openings in his meticulous control. She tested him subtly, slight deviations in routine, minute questions phrased differently, small sparks of defiance hidden beneath her obedience. And yet, even as she plotted, she felt the weight of inevitability. She knew the night would end with violence, with bloodshed, and with the forest swallowing secrets that no one would ever uncover. Her diary was her only armor, her knowledge the only tool she could wield, and in the darkness, with the wind whispering through the trees, Mercy resolved she would survive. She would endure. She would remember everything, catalogue everything, and ensure that one day the truth, the machinery of his horror, would not be buried. Morning came, pale and cold, yet Mercy felt no relief. The forest was silent, unnaturally so, as if it too held its breath for the horrors that had unfolded. Daniel returned from his excursion, pockets laden with stolen valuables, his expression calm, as if the night's acts were nothing more than routine. Mercy, hidden behind her composure, felt the crushing weight of the truth she now carried. She was the only witness, the sole recorder of calculated murder, and her own hands had unknowingly aided his system. The intelligence Daniel had once praised had become both a curse and a weapon, chaining her to a predator while granting her the insight to survive. Her diary was a sanctuary, a place where she could map his methods, trace his patterns, and catalogue every detail that no one else could see. Every family, every movement, every subtle question he asked, their trust exploited, their hopes manipulated, was now etched into her memory and onto paper. And she realized, with a chilling clarity, that Daniel's system was larger than the wilderness, reaching beyond the cabin, beyond the families, into hidden networks of control that Mercy could barely comprehend. Yet within this grim understanding, a spark of resolve began to burn. She could not stop him openly, but she could observe, anticipate, and document. Knowledge, she realized, was her lifeline. Every secret she captured was armor, every observation a shield. She understood that survival meant more than obedience. It demanded patience, cunning, and the quiet cultivation of a strategy invisible to Daniel. And now, for those watching, it is time. Comment the phrase, "I hold the truth," twice below. Let it anchor you, a symbolic acknowledgement that knowledge changes perception, that awareness is power, and that once you see what others cannot, your world is never the same. Mercy's mind, sharpened by fear and clarity, begged and to transform. She was no longer a victim. She was a silent witness, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, and the forest had become her teacher in the art of survival. By midsummer, Mercy had learned to move within Daniel's system without drawing suspicion. Every gesture, every word, every note in her diary was calculated, invisible, a silent act of resistance hidden behind the mask of obedience. She began to experiment with small manipulations, a question phrased differently, a misfiled note, a delayed observation. Each tiny deviation tested the limits of his control, revealing cracks in the perfection he believed unshakable. Her mind had become a battlefield, fear and strategy intertwined, each thought a measure of survival. Daniel, ever confident, continued his orchestration. Families arrived, unaware that the wilderness itself had become a theater of predation. He catalogued possessions, studied routines, and measured vulnerability with meticulous precision. Yet Mercy, now a keen observer and silent analyst, saw more than he intended. She noticed subtle signs in his behavior, the way he hesitated before entering a camp, the moments his eyes lingered too long on certain belongings, the faint tension in his jaw when his plans met unexpected variables. These were the openings she needed. Her pregnancy, once a source of vulnerability, had become a shield, an excuse to remain unseen, unchallenged. By day she appeared docile, obedient, devoted. By night, she mapped the architecture of his crimes in her diary, cross-referencing patterns, anticipating movements and calculating probabilities. Each observation was a thread in a web she was beginning to understand, a web that might one day allow her to navigate or escape the nightmare entirely. Mercy's awareness had become a weapon, subtle but lethal in its potential. She knew that every secret, every act of control, every hidden agenda must be remembered. Survival demanded vigilance, cunning, and patience, and as the forest whispered around her cabin, she realized she was no longer me. Rely a victim, she was a strategist, a silent force learning to manipulate the predator from within, waiting for the moment when knowledge would be her ultimate weapon. Another family arrived, their laughter and chatter cutting through the wilderness like a fragile ribbon of hope. Mercy watched from the cabin, stomach tight with the weight of foreknowledge. She had learned to read Daniel now, to anticipate the precise cadence of his manipulation, the almost imperceptible calculations behind every question, every smile. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he moved among them, extracting information with surgical precision, and Mercy, helpless to intervene, felt both terror and grim fascination. That night, Daniel carried out another act of violence, systematic, deliberate, and terrifying in its efficiency. Mercy's pulse raced as she observed from the shadows, recording every detail in her diary. The family's possessions, their plans, their trust, each carefully catalogued, each item a thread in Daniel's intricate system. She could feel the pulse of evil like a living thing, and she understood with sick clarity that this was no isolated pattern. Daniel's control extended far beyond the families he guided. It was a structure, a network, a method that few would ever see. Yet within the horror, Mercy found a spark of agency. She could not stop the act, but she could observe, learn, and remember. Her mind became a tool of resistance, cataloging patterns, predicting moves, and recording truths that Daniel would never suspect she held. Every detail was ammunition for the future, a silent promise to herself that survival would require cunning and patience. And now, for those watching, I ask you to engage as Mercy must engage with knowledge. Comment, I see the shadows twice. Let it mark awareness, the recognition that truth is often hidden, and that once seen, perception can never be undone. Mercy's transformation was nearing completion. She was no longer naive, no longer passive. She had become a silent strategist, a recorder of horrors, and a young mind learning to navigate the darkness with intellect, patience, and precision. The nightmare was real, but she had begun to claim a small, vital part of it for herself. Mercy had reached a new level of awareness. The forest, the families, Daniel's meticulous system, all of it had become a landscape she could navigate in secret. Each day she practiced small acts of influence, shifting a log slightly to alter a trail, misplacing a note to test his attention, observing how he reacted to the smallest changes in routine. These were imperceptible to him, but to her they were victories, tiny affirmations of agency in a world dominated by his control. Daniel remained the predator, unaware that his apprentice of sorts had begun to think in parallel, mapping his patterns, cataloging his behaviors, and quietly assessing the limits of his dominance. Every compliment he gave, every soft word, was no longer a chain, but a data point. Mercy analyzed, internalized, and refined her strategy. She understood that his system relied on obedience, trust, and ignorance, and she was now mastering all three without giving herself away. The next family arrived, and Mercy's pulse quickened. They carried the same mix of hope and naivety as those before them, a cruel repeat of the cycle she had witnessed so many times. Daniel's charm worked like a scalpel, cutting through defenses, cataloguing weaknesses, and extracting every useful detail. Mercy observed silently, recording each interaction, each subtle micro-expression, each question designed to probe wealth and vulnerability. Her pregnancy made her appear fragile, helpless, compliant, an illusion that concealed a mind sharpening like a blade. She realized that survival demanded patience, timing, and precise observation. Every detail she captured, every subtle disruption she introduced into Daniel's carefully controlled environment became a thread in a web she was learning to command. Mercy was no longer a passive witness. She had become a strategist, a silent force learning to manipulate the predator from within. And as the night closed in, she understood a truth as chilling as Daniel's acts. Knowledge was power, and she now held more than anyone could imagine. Mercy's mind had become a weapon, honed by fear, observation, and the relentless calculus of survival. She moved through the cabin like a shadow, her body still and compliant, while her thoughts raced with strategy. Daniel remained the orchestrator, precise and unyielding, but Mercy now anticipated his every move. She could see the invisible threads of his control, the psychological levers he used to bend people to his will, and she began to manipulate them subtly, carefully, with precision born of necessity. That night, the forest held its usual stillness, a deceptive calm. Mercy observed Daniel preparing for another phase of his system, another family soon to fall into his trap. Her heart raced, not with fear alone, but with the adrenaline of empowerment. She subtly rearranged the cabin, misplacing small items, shifting notes, and leaving traces that would force Daniel to adjust. These were tiny cracks, imperceptible to him, yet they gave her a sense of control she had never felt before. In her diary, she recorded every detail: his routines, his questions, the timing of his movements, the psychological patterns he relied on. Each entry was a blueprint of the predator, a map of the machinery of death that Daniel had perfected. And within those pages, she plotted, not yet for confrontation, but for survival. Her first deliberate act of defiance was small, almost invisible, but monumental in her own mind. She allowed a family's detail, a small possession, a minor route change, to remain unnoted, breaking the precision of Daniel's calculations. It was a subtle rebellion, yet it marked a turning point. Mercy realized she was no longer merely a witness. She had become a strategist, an invisible force shaping the predator's world, learning to navigate the darkness on her own terms. From that night onward, the balance of power had shifted, imperceptibly but irreversibly, in her favor. The forest had grown silent again, but Mercy's mind was alive with clarity. She had survived months of calculated terror, observed the full architecture of Daniel's system, and tested the limits of his control. Fear no longer dictated her actions. Knowledge, patience, and strategy had replaced it. Every movement he made, every word, every manipulation had been catalogued, analyzed, and understood. She carried the horrors in her mind, yet within that darkness, she had forged a new identity, not a victim, not a pawn, but a silent force capable of navigating a predator's world. That night, as Daniel slept, she traced the patterns in her diary one final time. She reviewed every family, every calculation, every act of psychological dominance he had executed. The forest outside was alive with shadows, whispering secrets only she could interpret. For the first time, she realized that survival did not mean obedience. It meant mastery of knowledge, invisibility, and patience. She could manipulate without revealing herself, predict without being seen, and endure without surrendering her mind or soul. Mercy understood now that the wilderness had been her crucible, and the horrors she had witnessed had forged her intellect, perception, and resilience into weapons. The predator she had feared, studied, and quietly resisted had unknowingly trained her in the very tools that might one day allow her to escape or endure indefinitely. She was no longer the girl who had arrived at 11, innocent, trusting, and fragile. She was a witness, a keeper of forbidden truths, a strategist in a world where darkness often hides in plain sight. And now, for those listening, remember this: knowledge changes perception. Awareness demands responsibility. Once you see the machinery of control, the hidden agendas, the manipulation, you cannot unsee it. The world is never the same, and like Mercy, you must carry the truth, navigate the shadows, and survive. Because some knowledge is dangerous, and some knowledge, once held, transforms you forever.